Court of Appeal judges Fatuma Sichale and Okwengu today faced the Judicial Service Commission as it continues interviewing candidates for the position of Deputy Chief Justice. Lady Justice Sichale served as the Deputy Director of the defunct Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, now known as the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. Here is part of this morning proceedings.
Because if the Kenyan people had said, you have to go, then really it was time to go. However, I needed to wait for my boss to come back to the country because I was heading the commission that was tasked with carrying out sometimes very sensitive investigations, and there was no way I was just going to abandon them, and I ran out. Now, when the director came and I gave him the report and what had been happening in the commission, my final statement to him was that I'm going to resign. And he said to me, he is also going to resign. If I was going to resign, he was also going to resign. But before we quit, we must do a handing over program. We must appoint an acting director, and we must actually issue the annual report that used to come out during the month of October. This was around September. For me, a day in that commission during that time was like a year. Here we are caught in between a rock and a hard place. You have to accomplish these tasks. The parliament is crying out that you must exit. And when eventually it was time to go, and I had issued a notice to the officers a week in advance saying that there was going to be a very important announcement that was going to be made. On that day of resignation was really like a very happy day for me.
Is the war against corruption objective? Do you apply an objective test at the KACC?
Yes, yes.
Do you always charge those who want to be, do you always charge all those against whom there are cases? Or are you selective? Why are you selective? Let me do this during your time. Why are you selective in taking people to court? Selective?
No. For me, I've always been guided by fairness.
Okay, let me reframe my question.
Yes.
Did you always investigate cases that needed to be investigated? Or you investigated some?
Very many cases would be reported. Very many complaints would come to the commission. And of course, because of the sheer magnitude, there would be prioritization.
Okay.
All right, and to give us more details on how these particular interviews went down, joining us from the Supreme Court is our reporter, Murimi Mwangi, who covered that particular interview. Murimi, a very good afternoon to you. Many thanks for joining us. What are some of the issues that these particular individuals had to contend with as they seek to replace Kalpana Rawal for the position of Deputy Chief Justice?
Good afternoon, Akisa. Today was the day for Court of Appeal judges Fatuma Sichale, who appeared before the JSC in the morning, and her colleague, Hannah Okwengu, whose interview was still ongoing a few minutes before I stepped out of the Supreme Court. And key among the issues that JSC was focusing on was not only on the history of these candidates, their previous work and where they've worked before, but also their understanding of the law, and in particular the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and how they can improve the work within the judiciary, and particularly on how they can tackle the backlog of cases, which remains one of the biggest challenges for the Kenyan courts, particularly the High Court. But for Fatuma Sichale, a substantive amount of time in that interview was spent questioning how she performed as the Deputy Director of the defunct Kenya Anti-Corruption Authority, and ultimately when she joined the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission sometime after the coalition government took power. And she said that the commission or her office did quite a substantive amount of work, and one of the things that she takes to her credit was the recovery of Grand Regency, which was ultimately handed over to the Central Bank of Kenya. But at the time, the statutes of the Central Bank did not allow CBK to own any assets, and ultimately the Central Bank of Kenya had to sell that particular hotel. And there was much controversy about how that was done, but she said that from their end at the defunct KACC and ultimately KACC, they did their work, which was to recover assets in that particular Goldenberg scandal. But of course, part of the discussion that has been ongoing even for the interview of Hannah Okwengu has been issues of the Supreme Court. And one key question that has consistently dominated these interviews since those of the Chief Justice to now these of the Deputy Chief Justice is the jurisdictional trajectory of the court within the 4 or 5 years that the Supreme Court has been in existence. And of particular concern has been the issue of the introduction or the opening of the Supreme Court window to election petitions other than the presidential petition. Remember, constitutionally, the Supreme Court is the court of original jurisdiction on matters of the presidential election petition. But in the past few years, we have seen more election petitions coming from the Court of Appeal, appeals emanating from such petitions finding their way here at the Supreme Court. And the upshot of that has been an increased backlog of cases even here at the Supreme Court. And one of the key issues that the JSC has been grappling with is to try and understand to what extent these applicants for these positions of Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice, and possibly even for the interviews of the judge of the Supreme Court, what they would do to tackle that issue of backlog. And key among those issues would, of course, to broker a consensus as to if the Supreme Court should entertain appeals emanating from election petitions that have been concluded at the Court of Appeal. Akisa.
Murimi, thank you very much for that update. Of course, Murimi Mwangi joining us from the Supreme Court there with details on how the particular interviews for Lady Justices Fatuma Sichale and Hannah Okwengu went on.